Hi everyone. This lecture is lecture 10.1, Drugs and Racism. This lecture will be talking about the racial implications of the war on drugs, what the war on drugs generally was, still sort of is, and how perception can impact crime rates. So, if you're 30 plus, maybe, or around that age, you'll know exactly what the war on drugs is. But if you're a little younger, you might not necessarily know what the war on drugs was. The war on drugs was an initiative started under President Reagan in the 1980s to eliminate or minimize drug use in the United States, with a special focus on preventing drug use in teens and children. As such, they were trying to directly talk to kids. Um, so there were a lot of cartoons in the 1980s talking about drugs. There's a lot of weird stuff that appeared during that era. DARE was one of the most widespread and well-known programs to exist during this era to talk to kids. It was one example of a program that exemplifies the problem with all aspects of the war on drugs. DARE was incredibly popular, which is actually part of the problem, sort of. DARE was a program that teamed high schools and elementary schools with police departments, and police taught children the dangers of drug use. On its surface, it sounds like something that absolutely would work and could work. You know, you're building community. You are, showing the police are human beings. It's fundamentally a good and interesting idea. And those programs were wildly popular, like I said. Schools liked working with police, and police liked working with schools. It was a very popular program, and no one's saying it failed in that regard. However, once we actually look at it from a social scientific lens, substantive studies with detailed statistics and long-term data repeatedly show that it just doesn't work. The short-term impact of learning the negative impacts of drugs simply does not prevent young people from using drugs. It just doesn't work. Telling elementary school kids about how bad drugs are doesn't embed itself in the brain of a child. If you do it for a week, it doesn't embed itself into the brain of a child so that in 8 years, when they're thinking about smoking marijuana or whatever, it doesn't carry over. And continuing such programs, despite overwhelming evidence saying that the programs were not working, was endemic in the war on drugs. Effectively, DARE doesn't work. We, as social scientists and other groups, told DARE and similar programs repeatedly that DARE doesn't work, but they continued to do DARE, and in some areas they still continue to do DARE, effectively wasting resources, effectively wasting the time of the police on a program that simply doesn't work because schools like working with cops and cops like working with schools. Um, you could build a different program. You could build a program about, hey, these are police in your community that doesn't even have to do with drugs, and you could maintain those positive elements. But, sorry about that. But it continues, and yeah, it's to people that know the data and have seen the data and analyzed the data. It's really kind of overwhelming. And if you're really interested in it, I can get that data to you. You know, if you'd want to actually see the numbers and not just trust me. So a lot of the parts of the war on drugs didn't work. So where did it come from? Well, in the 1960s, I don't know why that keeps doing that. In the 1960s and 70s, attitudes toward many things in society changed, including drugs. So in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of a notorious time for drug use. The use of marijuana by whites was relatively uncommon until the 1960s. There were some people, some white people specifically, that did use marijuana, but it wasn't really a common thing until the 60s. Um, and then we also saw cocaine get rolled into that in the 70s, right? And a lot of that was what really caused the war on drugs. And then in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan was elected president, largely due to a backlash against social change, not just drugs, but other social changes that were occurring at the time. And one of Reagan's major campaign stances was a strong anti-drugs policy. But it should be noted that even though Republican officials were the one that put the war on drugs in place, the war on drugs was also very popular with Democrats during the 1980s too. And that's laid out very clearly in page 34 of our reading. One of the assumptions of the war on drugs was that drug addiction was an epidemic or a plague sweeping America, and that this epidemic or plague was especially bad in urban areas. News stations, which were dramatically more influential at that time than they are now, used these narratives to spread fear. These depictions were inaccurate and in most times problematic. Specifically, they were specifically problematic for racial reasons. It both spread the not truth that crack addiction was everywhere, and also depicted drug addicts as being overwhelmingly black, or at least overwhelmingly not white, which, you know, minority groups, non-white groups, aren't spread evenly around the country. So it's also a logical fallacy, right? So if you show drug addicts as being overwhelmingly not white, but many parts of the country are overwhelmingly white, but drugs are everywhere, right? Those things don't all jive together. It wasn't a particularly I mean, no panics really are logical, but it was both illogical and deeply problematic and deeply racist. Drug users were typically portrayed as being lower class and black, despite the fact that drugs are used by all elements of society. We'll touch more on that in the following slides, but that is something to emphasize. Just like domestic abuse that we've talked about, drug use is similarly evenly spread across society. Now, there might be a slight difference on the types of drugs used, particularly when we talk about what drugs rich people use versus what drugs poor people use, because of quality. But actual use of drugs is evenly spread across society for most intents and purposes. And when taught, it's important to remember that the drug use of the 1970s and drug use in all eras is a little bit different, right? So in the 70s, cocaine was the big deal, right? Heroin wasn't really the thing that it is today. Cocaine was a relatively new drug to the United States. It was sometimes portrayed as being, quote, the champagne of drugs. That's actually, some people talked about it like that. And some people talked about cocaine as being not addictive. Here we have a really almost mind-blowing ad from a magazine from the 1970s on these are cocaine. This is cocaine paraphernalia. That is a spoon that you would use to scoop and put up to your nose and snort, right? And that is a box for keeping your cocaine in. And this was, I mean, it still is technically legal to sell a box and a little spoon, but this was specifically being put in legitimate magazines toward the end of selling drug paraphernalia, which in our post-war on drugs world is almost inconceivable. Now, there is a very distinct difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. And one of the major issues with the war on drugs was the overemphasis on crack cocaine. Crack is a less expensive version of cocaine. It is made by mixing cocaine with baking soda and water, and then the solution is boiled to remove the water. So it's, if you know how to make sugar candy, right? Sugar candy crystals. It's actually a relatively similar process to that. And the end result is crack rock, which is the unit of crack, if you will, which would be sold for about, I don't know, $5 or so. Crack is smoked while cocaine is typically snorted. The high with crack is stronger, but it doesn't last as long. And it is also dramatically cheaper. So there you see the difference in the drugs used, right? So powder cocaine was more of a drug of rich people, and it was more expensive, while crack cocaine was cheaper and particularly popular in poor urban black settings. Now, and this is just, more sussing out that difference between the socio-cultural use of powder cocaine and crack. Cocaine was relatively popular in the period, and there were very specific social inequalities in that era. And remember, all people of all classes tend to use drugs about equally, as I mentioned. I'm just laying this out logically. Then rich white people would be more likely to use powder cocaine, and poor black people would be more likely to use crack cocaine. This is generally how the socioeconomics and the drug use culture of that time played out. Now, this created, during the 1980s and 90s, and still to a degree today, but really it created a major an incredibly major issue in that era. Problematic race relations. So, the Controlled Substance Act, which was passed in the 1980s, established mandatory minimum sentencing for first-time drug offenders. And, a lot of times, and I put that's a little bit cheeky, but it's a reasonable point. First-time drug offenders being stupid teenagers and dumb 20-somethings, right? Those are the people that get caught with drugs for the first time. And it was first-time drug offenders minimum mandatory sentence of 5 years for a first-time trafficking offense. And what classified as a first-time trafficking offense, that is the major issue with the Controlled Substances Act, with mandatory minimums. So for powder cocaine, trafficking meaning you are intending to deal drugs, which may or may not be true, but this is the, how they get you effectively. So for 500 grams of powder cocaine, that would be 5 years in prison. No matter what. No matter who you are, whether you were someone really influential's kid, whether you were a super good kid, whether you were a straight A student, whether you were a straight F student, whether you were a quote-unquote bad kid. It didn't matter who you are. First-time offense, 5 years in prison. Now, if you break out the math of this 500 grams for powder coke for 5 years, or 5 grams of crack for 5 years, if you break down the serving size of drugs, if you will, which I did have to go into a little less than reputable internet dive. Don't use bluelight.com or answers.com for a reference, please. They're not really that credible, but this is just to make this point. If I were to actually publish this in a real paper, I would do a heck of a lot more thorough research, or if I were to turn in a paper for college, mind you. But let's just use this for the moment. So, if you assume that 0.25 grams is a rail of cocaine, And I hope no one's mothers are walking in as I'm giving this presentation. Um, then 500 grams of cocaine, which would be 5 years in prison, would be about 2,000 servings of cocaine, right? So you get 5 years in prison for having 2,000 servings. That's almost reasonable if you think that people with cocaine should be put in jail, which, a lot of people do. And then you consider that to crack, right? Which is the drug that, black people during this era would be more likely to use. Zero point 0.1 gram is the serving per rock. You would smoke a rock of crack, right? Thus, 5 grams would be 50 servings. 5 years in prison. Okay. And there's the disparity, right? So, 500 grams, 500 servings. No, I'm sorry, I screwed that up. 2,000 servings. A drug dealer with 2,000 servings of drugs, carrying that around, versus a drug dealer with 50 servings of drugs, carrying that around. Those are two very different kinds of drug dealers, aren't they? Those are two very different kinds of drug dealers. The 50 servings of crack, that might be someone who has a really bad addiction, but isn't necessarily even a dealer, right? 2,000, that's someone that's doing a business, right? It's so much different. It's so much different, and it's almost mind-boggling because overwhelmingly the one with the cocaine during the 80s and 90s would have been white, and the one with the crack during that time would have been black. So this leads to the issues, one of the major cornerstones of the issues with the war on drugs. So if a white person were caught with drugs and those drugs were powder cocaine, they would have to do 200 servings for 2,000 servings. If a black person were caught with drugs and their drugs were crack cocaine, they would possess only 50 servings for 5 years in jail. And the question then is raised, isn't crack more dangerous? The short answer to that is not quite. There are some differences, but fundamentally, the drugs are effectively both as dangerous. You can see there's a really good documentary that we're probably going to be using in our conversation this week, called Crack Babies, A Tale from the Drug Wars. If we don't use it this week, you can YouTube search that pretty easily. There's no such thing as a crack baby. It's a common myth. And that documentary explains it really well. But the question is probably in a few people's minds. Obviously, yeah, there are white people who are in prison for dealing crack, obviously. And there are black people in prison for dealing powder cocaine. Sure, absolutely. That's also a reality. But if we're looking at the statistics of it, and we're looking at what does actually happen, what's the fact of the matter, what happens more frequently, those patterns are what we find, or at least found in the 80s and 90s. And if you understand the difference in the demographic use of those drugs, you understand how, with this one of my favorite and deeply troubling charts, how the prison population in the United States, how the general population of the United States is only 12% black people, but the prison population in the United States is almost 40% black people. Well, it's because it is dramatically easier if you are somebody in possession of drugs in the United States to be put in prison if you are black than if you're white. And this is just one piece of that argument, right? And it isn't a perfectly perfect argument, but it's just one major factor in that overblown prison population element. Okay, and that's a big piece of why the war on drugs was incredibly, and continues to a degree, be incredibly problematic in terms of race. So we will explore this a little bit more this week, and I look forward to some interesting conversation. Thanks.